Hello, everybody. In this week's episode, we talk with Cecilia Lanata-Briones. Cecilia lived through hyperinflation in Argentina and studied both in Argentina and in the UK. After that, she worked in the public sector and now teaches in London. We talk about the history of economics, about the Indo-American Refugee and Migrant organization, and her research on comparing countries and their Ginis. Next to that, we discuss D-ECON, Decolonizing economics, and what the difference are between economic education in Argentina and the UK. Enjoy this week's episode. Thank you for rethinking with us. Hey Cecilia, thank you so much for being here. How are you?
I am good. Yeah, it's good because it's sunny today. So, that it's, in the UK, that's a precious thing. So, it always makes your day a little bit better.
So, what are you most excited about right now?
Actually, I don't know if the word is excited, but I'm like quite looking forward to the university year starting. It hasn't started yet here in the UK. So I know it's going to be a tough year. I know it's going to be a difficult year, but I am actually, I wouldn't say excited, but anxious in a good way to see how things are going to be and what's going to happen.
Because you teach at where do you teach in the UK?
So I teach at the University of Warwick. In the economics department, obviously. I teach mainly economic history and macroeconomics. So, classes start in a couple of weeks, or in a week and a half, actually. And it's gonna be an interesting year.
So what do you teach? What kind of courses do you like to teach?
Well, what I like to teach and what I teach I actually at the moment are the same thing. That hasn't happened in the past necessarily, but at the moment, I teach, as I was saying, economic history. So at Warwick, there's compulsory economic history for first-year undergraduate students. So I don't remember exactly the name of it, but I think it's a world history or something along those lines. But it's economic history, and compulsory first year. So I do seminars in that, and then I have a third-year module called Topics in Economic History, which is an elective course, so it's not compulsory. It's just started. It's a new course. I started teaching last year in September 2019 at work, so I started doing that course. So I really, really like that. It's the best in terms of teaching for me. I don't know if students will necessarily think that, but I really, really enjoy it. And I also teach macroeconomics. Which I do seminars mainly of that. I get the compulsory first year course, so macroeconomics 1. And then we also teach macroeconomics for PPE, so politics, philosophy, and economics students that take economics, obviously, as well. That's part of their degree, so I teach them, and that's also quite macro, and that's also quite cool. I like that because it has they're interesting to, they have a different view than purely economists on macro, even if it's the same macro really that we teach. But it's good to have a variety of students to teach to.
That's interesting. So is there a difference between what are the differences between teaching macro to just economic students or PPE students?
Well, I think at work, both set of students ask really, really interesting questions. But what I like about the PPE students is that they have this view and they have this knowledge, right? Because obviously they study politics, for example. So they try to dig in the political economy of things in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
They try to understand more how economic decisions can be coordinated with political decisions. So it's a different type of question that me I find slightly more interesting. It's a personal, it's a thing, you know. It's not better or worse in any way, shape, or form. Uh, I like teaching macro, so I like anyone that comes to me with questions about it. But this idea of thinking beyond just the economic, you know, outlook, and just, you know, just the economic implications of certain decisions, but trying to think about the politics and the effects for society. It's something that I am interested in personally. So when I can discuss that with students, I like it more. Yeah, it's not a preference. It's just, you know, what interests me as well, let's say.
Mm. And next to teaching, do you also do research?
I do research, yes, and in economic history mainly, and not your typical economic history either, as you would, mainstream economic history, I guess, which is, you know, mainly kind of economics with a very long run perspective, in my view, which is really interesting and very important. But I'd like to do, again, some research that doesn't necessarily put all these different variables in an econometrics model. So I do very different things, let's say.
Like what?
Like what? Yeah, I know that's the follow-up question, right? So no, my interest in it is basically the study of the production and use of economic statistics. So the relationship between national statistical agencies, for example, like the ONS in the UK, the Office for National Statistics, and how do at different points in time start producing certain indicators like GDP, you know, your usual suspects, GDP, the CPI, etc. And how do they design them, the methodology, and how that responds to the uses that they want to give that to that indicator, and, you know, how then that indicator is used to design policy or just to kind of analyze the economy.
Interesting. Okay. So, how did you get into history of economics? Why did it interest you so much?
Well, so I was studying, as an undergrad. I was studying, so I have degree and undergraduate degree in economics, but I also have an undergraduate degree in sociology. So I was studying both degrees at the same time. And why are you laughing?
It's ambitious.
Yeah, yeah. And so I was studying both at the same time, and I was taking this history course in the sociology, now for my sociology degree. It was an Argentine history course. And they were, you know, there was this really, really good paper that was looking at the relationship between, you know, how the economy fluctuated in different policies and the different parties that were, you know, taking these policies. So a very, yeah, it's I don't know if it's in English, but it's like the most interesting paper I've ever read. Or I don't know if it's the most, but it's, you know, the one that kind of was the turning point for me, because it, you know, it was everything that I was looking for in terms of me studying these two degrees separately, right? Because I thought, you know, either of them on their own was not enough in terms of how I wanted to understand the world, or what I thought you know, how I could understand the world. And this paper was just combining, right, an economic analysis and historical, obviously, and so Argentina in the 50s, 60s. This was the early 2000s that I read it, and the relationship between what was happening in economic terms and and policy decisions, and the different parties, and the effects that had on unemployment and people's lives and blah blah blah. So I thought, oh, that's what I really like. This is what I want to do, and I've always liked history, right? So it was, since, you know, I can remember. So yeah, so it was that paper that, you know, that got me thinking that economic history was a thing, and it could be done. And I was like, oh, this is what I want to study. Yeah, so that's the economic history interest. And then I guess that the other thing that it's also important is inflation. In Argentina, inflation has always been an issue not always, but always for in my lifetime. Like, hyperinflation. I was, a child of the hyperinflation episodes of 89, 91. And inflation is this huge thing. And yeah, so I needed to understand. I still don't understand, but I still needed to feel like, there's one of those things that you need to understand. Something that's so kind of, characteristic of where you live in, and it shapes people's lives. Makes their decisions, about, buying things now rather than tomorrow. And, yeah, inflation.
So, what was it like to live in hyperinflation? Because you learn about it in economics, but you never really think about what it's like to actually live or have to deal with that. Like, what are things that you have to think about?
Well, I was little in, 89, 91. So it's more of memories that I have than, yeah, I guess that, my mom, my dad, my grandparents would be able to tell you a bit better about that. But my memory was like of, first of all, around, if you needed money, you carry around loads of, notes, but bills, pieces of paper that were worth less and less. And every time that I went to buy sweets and things like that, I was 89, 90, 91, I must have been like, yeah, 7 and 7, 8. And, going to the shop to buy cookies and sweets and candy and stuff, it was just first not something that happened very often. And every time that I went, it was just like, I needed more money. And I was like, how is this possible, right? I was here 2-3 days ago. And people were just, spending the money as soon as they, as they got paid, because you didn't know, if you kept that money in your pocket, let's say, how much you would have been able to buy 2 weeks after that, 3 weeks after that. So it's like, it's the memories, right? I don't, I think I was lucky enough not to have to be worried about spending that money and bringing up 3 kids. But yeah, it's so those things that it's just. And then we moved to the US in the middle of the hyperinflation episodes, because my mom went to do her PhD and things were different, right? So it's not like inflation was there. It was a thing, right? It was a
What do you mean
contrast.
it's different?
That those things that you experience, right? This idea of, going to the shops and buying candy, and it was just like, okay, you don't need more and more coins and notes and stuff. It was just a stability that it was the shock, I guess, because we left in the middle of the issue, of the hyperinflation episode. So I think it's that contrast that made it, a thing for me.
Okay. So that is what got you into economics then? Or
I guess that's sort of, it was in the back of my head for a very long time, right? How these things work, and trying to understand how these things are possible. Because it was, it was within days that I was living in a different place, and things were completely different, right? So yeah, it made it interesting, to say, okay, how does the economy, at that time, obviously I didn't know anything about the economy or what the economy was, but when you grow up and then you start thinking and about these things, you're like, oh, okay, so this is economics. What else what can economics teach us, let's say.
so did you then study in the US, or did you go back
No,
to
we were in the US for only less than 3 years. So then when we went back to Argentina was a different place in the 90s, or in the mid 90s. But yeah, so then I studied in Argentina, my undergrad. Yes.
And how was that? Because did you read like Spanish research? Did you read research from other countries? How did that work when you were studying? Was it very different than now as you're teaching in the UK? Was it a very different way of university?
So university, yeah, totally different. I can only speak for, if you want, if we're thinking of a comparison, right? I can only speak for economics because yeah, that's what I learned back home in Argentina, and that's what I teach and what I'm in touch with here, right? So so in that regard, it's quite different, or I feel that it's quite different, basically because we back home had this very long degree that lasted around 5.5 years, the undergraduate. Yes, it's long. And it was full of, or it was mainly, not at my university at least, compulsory modules, compulsory courses, right? So I think it was around 30, it was 33 or 35 modules that I had to take, right? Credits, I guess it would be. And let's say if they were 35, 33 were compulsory, right? So I took loads of different courses that what I see my students now take as elective were compulsory, right? So I had development economics, international economics, obviously econometrics and all of that, economic history, Argentine economic history, world economic history, history of economic thought, macro, micro, 1, 2, all of that. I don't know, finance, all those things I had to take, right? And sit and pass. Which was tedious if you didn't like the modules, obviously, but it was great in the sense that I think I learned a lot. I learned a lot of stuff that obviously was translated into Spanish because I went to a public university and they couldn't teach anything that was in English, right? So I studied macro and I taught macro back home with textbooks that were translated mainly, so Blanchard, right?
So how did that affect your education that everything had to be translated from English to Spanish?
I guess that it's sort of a narrower than what I think students get here, right? Because every economics is it's I'm not saying no content is produced in other languages, but the content that inverted commas matters is produced in English. That's my hunch, right? Obviously, I mean, there's a lot of research and things being written in Spanish. I know this because I have loads of colleagues that work, that are economists and produce things in Spanish, right? But and I've read a lot of that, and that was great because also there's a lot of heterodox economics being written in Spanish. Or maybe that's just the crowd that I hang out with, and that's my friends of today and the stuff that I found interesting to read. But I think in terms of what inverted commas counts, if you want to leave Argentina and study elsewhere, you only get to read what's being translated, right? So you're sort of it's you're sort of kind of, your hands are tied if you don't know any other language, basically, I think. But I'm assuming that doesn't just happen back home, right? But
So how did you find that out? How did you figure out that there was a lot of things that you were missing because not everything was translated in Spanish?
I remember, so it was towards the end of my degree. I didn't find out then, but I remember this being kind of like eye-opening I was a development economics course, and we had our compulsory readings, right? That were obviously again all in Spanish, and there was, because it was the end, it was towards the end, that course, that module, towards the end of the degree, that they sort of started, putting non-compulsory readings in English or mentioning them, and I remember that's the first time I came across Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, because it was, the beginning again, early 2000s. So they were starting with their, their theory about institutions and all of that. And our, the lecturer then was like, well, there's new research coming out in development economics. Development economics seems to be kind of taking this into consideration. And he sort of mentioned, right, the institutional kind of, the good and bad institutions of Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson. And I was like, wow, opinions aside, this is like really, there's a lot of stuff happening that, we are not, they're not telling us, right? Or we can't find out because, that meant though, on the upside, that I was reading a lot of the classics, right? So we were reading a lot of Keynes, and we were reading Smith, and we were reading Ricardo, and we were reading Marx, stuff that here I find it that it's much harder to get across, to come across in like the raw pure form of actually reading The Wealth of Nations and the general theory and things like that. So I guess it's that fine balance of what, because obviously those things are translated in Spanish, right? Or were, at least. Maybe, I'm pretty sure now Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson is translated, but in the early 2000s, because it had just come out, it wasn't. And so yeah, that was sort of when I said, okay, so there's all these things that are, this, but it's just when they actually tell you, this is, this is like, what's being discussed now, that you say, okay, that, yeah, we're missing a lot, or not a lot. I don't know if, Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson is a lot, but you are, you're maybe lagging behind, let's say.
So what happened then after you found out, after you graduated? Where did you go? Did you stay in Argentina or?
I did for a while. So when I was doing 2 degrees, I didn't finish them at the same time. I finished economics first, so I got a job as an economist. I got a couple, but the one that I successive jobs, the one that I really, really like is I was in a research institute, and I was like a research assistant. And that was great because it was a it still exists, heterodox research institute that had this, everything I wanted in terms of having this, as I mentioned before, this way of looking at the economy that's not just about, the economy, but it's about politics, and it's about society, and, it's about gender differentials. And, even though most of us were economists, inverted commas, or had this economics training, it was a group of people, small group of people, still is a small group of people, that wanted to, understand things in a much more comprehensive, holistic way, let's say, rather than just, okay, so this is the economy, this is, these are the economic effects, done. So I was there for a couple of years, doing economic history, basically, or working on a project that, clearly, it didn't seem like it then, but it was clearly, an economic history project. Argentina trying to look at more of a kind of, development, growth, but in the long run. And that got, there I could, I started reading other things as well, which helped me in terms of kind of growth, right? Personal growth, and trying to trying to understand things in this more kind of comprehensive way that I've always looked for, if that makes sense.
So then, how did you get from there to the UK? Because now you're teaching in the UK. So
Yeah.
how did that happen?
How did that happen? Well, I wanted to continue my studies, and at some point during my undergraduate degree, someone had mentioned. I knew by then that I liked economic history, and I knew by then that I wanted to be in academia. Right, I was already teaching at uni, and I was now working at a research institute, so I knew that was the path, and I obviously wanted to continue studying. And I wanted to move abroad for a while. I wanted to study abroad, right? And someone had mentioned that the LSE, the London School of Economics here in the UK, had an economic history department, that it was really good, and there was this really good economic historian that specializes in Argentina, and I was like, okay, so that's where I want to go. I wanted to, so I applied for an MSc in the economic history department at the LSE, and got funded, which was also quite crucial because otherwise it would have been impossible. And I also knew that I wanted to do a PhD, right? So it was I knew that when I left for the MSc, it was highly likely that I was going to stay. Not necessarily at the LSE, though that's what I wanted because it was, an economic history PhD. But I thought, okay, this is going to be more than a year, hopefully. And that was 12 years ago. I'm still here, which is not exactly what I expected back then, but it's good.
So how was it to change from Argentina and from that education system to the UK? Were there big differences?
There were, obviously, an undergrad and an MSc are very different things anywhere, right? So regardless of where you are. But, I was used to studying a lot, and I liked it, obviously. But things were very different when I came here. This idea of, the independent study, you just didn't go to class and learned a lot, apart from obviously reading, right? But one of the first things that struck me here in the UK is the amount of independent study that's expected of you. I used to go to class for at least 6 hours per module, macro, micro, all of those. Here, it's our students get 3 hours a week. At Warwick, for example, 2 lecture hours, 1 seminar. In Argentina, macro, I had 6 hours a week of, classes, lecture and seminar and all of that, which meant that, obviously, I was at uni a lot. But then, that sort of counterbalanced the independent study in a way. And this was a lot of me studying and reading on my own, which was not that difficult, but it was different. And then the types of assessments, the assessment, the way students are assessed here in the UK, at least, it's quite different. Essays, you do a lot of essays here, which is, I think it's great, actually. But I've learned a lot. It was hard because I was obviously used to writing, but the idea of doing essays and, putting your argument forward, or some kind of argument forward, I wasn't that used to doing that at uni. And I think that's great, actually. It's a really important thing, you being able to build an argument, even if it's not your argument, right? But putting forward an idea in a way that, you justify why you're saying this and why you're saying that. So I thought, that was, apart from the fact that obviously, writing in English was not something that I was really used to. So, language barriers aside, I think that's, if you ask me what I learned during the master's, is to do an essay, which is actually really important, I think. And I wish they taught it in Argentina, from earlier on.
So that's something that at universities in Argentina could learn from the UK.
I think so. It's that type of assessment, right? Our universities in Argentina do many other really good things. But I think, if that type of assessment, it's not as common as it
So
is
what
here.
what can the UK universities learn from Argentina then? The other way around.
I guess that, for me, it was really crucial to have all these other compulsory courses that gave you a much broader notion of what economics is.
You don't see that in the UK, or
I mean, from what I see, you have obviously your compulsory micro, macro, and econometric stats. But then, it's great to have choices. Don't get me wrong. It's really good to have choices. But I think, having maybe it's a matter of having more courses, right? Which is it's a different type of it's a different type of thing, right? Maybe it's rethinking the degrees in a different way. But the fact that I got to learn not just economic history, right, which is obviously I'm biased towards that, but history of that I had a history of economic thought that was compulsory, development economics, which was compulsory, international economics, which was compulsory. All those things, I thought that was great. I think, I again 5.5 years, right, against 3, which is also, that's why I mean, you have more time to have compulsory courses because you're in there for longer, much longer, double the time potentially. So obviously, it's a very different thing, but I do think that having more compulsory courses is something that's controversial potentially, but really important from my experience again.
so a little bit different, but I guess on the same path is how what do you think students miss in their education? And what are lessons that you wish every student knew?
Well, this is quite biased. I mean, the answer that I have to is quite biased towards my research interest, right? Which is, this is, I think, regardless of my experience here in the UK and my experience in Argentina, is that economic students, or economists more broadly, we use numbers a lot, right? We cannot not know about certain things, and one of them are the use of statistics. Now I'm not talking about statistical methods, right, but the use of statistics, and I think we economists, or most economists, and most economic students, and that's something that I think they really don't get taught, from my experience anywhere, or very little, if you want, not anywhere, but very little, is that to be skeptical about numbers, right? So as I said to you before, I studied the production and use of public figures, right? GDP, CPI, and all of that, right? And we are taught to look at or to look at them more or less at face value, right? I think this is slightly changing, so I'm happy about this. But rather, I think what economic students are missing, and I guess that's not just economics, I think, for example, sociology students as well, trying to understand where these numbers come from, right? These numbers are produced for a reason. They're not objective. There's a definition behind them. So in order to, I'm not saying not use numbers. I'm just saying when you use numbers, try to look at them more critically. And if you want to, it's about awareness, right? Not as in criticizing numbers, but having a critical approach to publicly generated figures, at least all of them, but definitely the ones generated by governments.
Okay. So a little bit of a different topic, but you work with the IRMO London, the Indo-American Refugee and Migrant Organization. What do you do? What is the organization about?
So yeah, so IRMO, IRMO, is yeah, yeah, that's what they call it. So I say the same, but IRMO sounds good actually. So as you said, they're in the it stands for Indo-American Refugee and Migrant Organization. It's a charity that helps or provides services to recently arrived to the UK Latin American migrants, which is which they tend to come through. Loads of us Latin Americans have dual citizenship. So because some of us, our grandparents or parents, were born in Spain or in Italy or Portugal, and generally in the case of Brazilians, we can have that dual citizenship that allows us obviously to be in the EU. So a lot of people migrated from Latin America, right? Initially to obviously for language reasons, to Spain mainly. And then eventually, when things started not going great for Spain some time ago, moved to other parts, and a lot of them moved to the UK. And basically what we do is that provide different types of services for the Latin American community. Here, it's obviously in UK, but we generally work with people living in London because it's just a matter of they're closer, right, to the premises. And we provide services along the lines of welfare advice, immigration advice. We do English classes. We do classes because a lot of people work in the construction sector, and here to do that in the UK they need a permit that they need to do an exam for. So we do courses, half in Spanish, half in English, for people to prepare for those exams. English classes, did I say that? English classes, and things like that, to and help people basically settle
That's
here.
that's really great that you do that and that organization's there. That's so nice. Did you have anything like that when you came there, or did you kind of just jump in on your own?
No, so I joined IRMO not that long ago, actually 3 years maybe. So I wasn't a service user of IRMO, because I guess that yeah. Uh, so I'm sort of kind of, I miss being around the Latin American community, let's say. Or not that I hadn't been. There's loads of Latin Americans everywhere here, but getting involved with the community in a different way, it's really, really nice. And I guess that I wouldn't say that I have more time, but I have time that I didn't have before when I was studying and working, arguably, and now I just work. So I have a bit more time to get involved in other things, and I think IRMO does a great job. Loads of charities do a great job, but obviously I have a soft spot for my community, which is the Latin American community, and so yeah, it's good to be a part of the IRMO family.
That's great. So another project you also, I don't know how you relate to this project, but the Global Income Inequality Project?
Yeah, so that is a project that I did sort of like a postdoc there. So I was a research fellow after I finished my PhD, for, I think it lasted for a year and a half. It was a project funded by the ESRC, which is, I don't know, I wouldn't know exactly, I think it's Economic Social Research Council. It's a UK body that grants, research, provides grants to academia mainly. And so it was I think a 3 or 4 year project. I came in towards the end when I finished the PhD, which basically what we did there was try to, as the name says, estimate global income inequality on the basis though of historically to begin with, right? And on the basis of household budget surveys, which is something that obviously it's not very easy to do up until the 1970s when all countries started more or less producing and household budget surveys, right? We take them at face value and think they've been around for a while, but no, they haven't. So basically what we did in that project was build a database of household budget surveys worldwide as much as we could, because we were based in the UK, so that's not that easy. From whenever they existed, let's say, to the 1960s, 1970s, because then that they're much access to them is much easier since then, right? Since the 1960s, because they've become a regular thing, as I was saying. So we built a database with whatever we could find. So it's a lot of archival work, which is great for an economic historian because that's one of the things that we like to do. And then obviously on the basis of that, I'm simplifying this massively, right? We try to generate Ginis for different, on the basis of each household survey data. So yeah, for different parts of the world. And obviously it's a great, very ambitious project. And it was difficult because again, we were based here, right, in the UK. So it's not like we had the money to travel around the world doing, archival research. But yeah, and on the basis of that, we tried, as I said, estimate Ginis and try to see kind of what happened through time.
What happened through time?
It depends, right? Because we have we haven't had the chance yet to do a massively kind of global analysis, right? Because it's very, very difficult to do that because you have Ginis for different times of the world, or surveys actually, and then Ginis at different points in time for different groups of people in a country, right? So, for example, Latin America, most of the surveys that you have for the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s are household budget surveys of working class households, right? Because that's what they surveyed at the time. So it's very difficult to do, an Argentina Gini, a Brazil Gini, a Chile Gini on the basis of just data for the working class, right? Because you would expect that, those Ginis, not only they're not really representative of the whole country, but you would expect the working class not be so unequal relatively. Relatively, right? That doesn't happen, but at least at the very beginning, right? 1910s, 1920s. So we're still struggling with the methodology, of how to kind of extrapolate, if you want, this data that we have, which in many cases, or at least at the beginning, it's very specific to groups, to be able to say something that's meaningful for a country, meaningful for a region, meaningful for a time period. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. It sounds very hard to do because there are so many factors to factor into that, because how do you get the data from everywhere if you can't go there?
Well, yeah, that was the first big challenge, and that is why we're still struggling with actually producing output on this, is because throughout the lifetime of the project, the funding lifetime of the project, if you want, we spend most of our time looking for these reports. what we did, basically, we found what we could through interlibrary loans. So we knew that, they're mainly official reports, right? Because these household surveys, in their majority, but not all of them, were done by the national statistical agencies in each country, or some kind of public entity, right? A ministry of some sort. So there are publications that exist in different parts, that libraries in different parts of the world hold of these reports. So it wasn't that difficult to find them in that sense. But obviously what becomes really difficult is that you don't have the microdata, right? Because you just have the report that has the aggregate breakdown of, the, let's say, 10,000 households that were surveyed by, I don't know, income bands. So you just, right? So you don't have the microdata, you have the chart. And obviously just that chart limits the extent of your analysis. So that's one of the problems. And then you have, obviously, all these surveys are done methodologically wise. They're very different. Some of them were carried throughout a month. Not just, some of them were just the working class rather than society as a whole, but some of them, not necessarily representative samples within the working class. Some of them were done throughout a month. Some of them lasted for a year or 6 months or 3. So then you have all these other kind of methodological design of the survey complications that you have to account for, right? That make this even more difficult than what we were discussing.
How do you work with that? How do you figure that out if all the methodologies that they used are different? How do you compare that?
Well, we're in the process of that.
Okay.
It's difficult. It's really, really difficult, because it's not just that. Then it becomes not only about finding the survey and getting the data. You need to read properly, right? All the reports to be able to understand how each survey was carried out, right? So it's time consuming finding the data. It's time consuming reading loads of reports and trying to kind of see, try to understand what happened from the methodological side, to then be able to put, systematize all that. That's why we've decided to work on, that's why we haven't done anything global, right? Because if anything, we're trying to do stuff for a region or for a country or for a group of countries that have certain similarities in terms of, for example, the surveys that they carried out. So you need to kind of get your head around that before you do anything, or that then is worth showing to other people, right, and discussing with other colleagues. So yeah, it's a very much work in progress.
Yeah, I get that. So what do you want to change in economics? If you could change something, what would you be like? This one.
I guess that my greatest concern is, it's about how pluralistic economics is in many ways. But let's stick to two, which I think are really, really important. Not the most important, but for me are quite meaningful, let's say. One is pluralism regarding, schools of thought and different ways of, doing economics. Which is, I think, what, Rethinking Economics, or one of the things that Rethinking Economics tries to do. So I'm extremely happy that Rethinking Economics and other, organizations exist, right? And especially, that are student-led, if you want. That it's a reform that's being demanded from the start, in terms of, the start of your career, let's say. So that's one concern that I have. The other concern that I have in terms of pluralism, right, is it's a gender thing. I think economics is a very much dominated, male dominated, white male dominated discipline that um, that that needs changing because that economics is is something that determines people's lives, everyday lives, and if it's just mainly white male dominated, right, the worries of the white male are very different than the worries of the rest of society, basically. So I think, and I think that's tied to a great extent to the pluralism, in terms of thought and all the other things. They're not completely independent things. They're things that are extremely linked. So those are my concerns. That was the question, right? What are my concerns? Or not what I would change, or not how can I change? How can we change this, right? Because I don't have an answer to that.
Well, then I won't ask it.
No, but I think no. Let me actually. I mean, I think as I was saying, organizations like Rethinking. There's one other one that I'm involved in, which is D-ECON, developing, decolonizing and diversifying economics. Which they're moving towards that. That's the aim, right? More or less, having a more pluralistic, heterodox, diverse economics, right? So that's a way forward for sure.
Wow. Okay, so let's do a little lightning round. With every person on the podcast, we do a little lightning round. So just say the first thing that pops up in your head. Okay?
Okay.
All right. What is a skill any economist should learn?
Well, this goes back. I don't want to sound repetitive, but I think a skill is, being critical about numbers and, looking at these public figures, public numbers in a critical way, trying to look beyond, the increase in GDP and actually trying to understand how GDP was constructed to begin with, and your unemployment, or the CPI or whatever. I think that's a crucial skill.
Who do you admire or look up to in economics?
Well, that is a very easy answer for me, because that's my mentor. It's not going to be someone that probably is very well known, but his name is Rubén Lowolo. He's an Argentine economist. He's the director of the center, the research center that I mentioned before, where I worked before moving to the UK, which is called the Centro Interdisciplinario para el Estudio de Políticas Públicas, or CIEP. He is a brilliant heterodox economist. That's he's my mentor, and I think we should be reading him much more, let's say.
What is a question you want me to ask that I haven't asked you yet?
That's a difficult one, but I guess that you asked me about Irma, which I appreciate a lot, and it's always good to talk about Irma and Irma's cause. But I guess we talked about it without you asking me directly about it, which is about D-ECON, about decolonizing and diversifying economics, which, as I mentioned, is sort of another organization that championships causes like Rethinking does, and yeah, So I would have. That's the question. What does D-ECON do, for example?
So what do they do, and how are you active with them?
So what is D-ECON? So D-ECON is basically a group of people, of mainly economists, from different parts of the world, uh, that the aim, is to, get a more pluralistic curriculum, a more diversified curriculum, a decolonized curriculum in economics. So Decon does, like Rethinking in a way, organizes talks and things like that, blogs, and it's a very similar approach, if you want, in terms of getting the word out there about scholars, for example, right? That are not well known in the global north, right? So it tries to focus much more about what theories and what individuals uh, are being read, for example, in the global south, and and tries to get the word out there about their existence, for example. That's one of the things that D-ECON does.
So what does a decolonized economics look like, according to you?
That's a very difficult question. And I don't think I have an answer to that. That makes that I guess that in the Rethinking Festival, there was this panel about decolonizing economics that that I think was really interesting because really interesting because he had the views of three very different people from three different parts of the world, what decolonizing is, and I think that, I mean, some answer comes from there, and I think uh, that's worth listening to. Not to me talking in that one, but the other panelists that were there. But it's just for me, if you want, it's what the concerns. When you ask me about the concerns, it's a more pluralistic economics, if you want. That is not just about learning neoclassical economics that's produced by white male individuals in the global north. If you wanted it in a nutshell, but I think it's much more than that. But it could start there, a definition of decolonizing economics.
So where can people find the things that you are most enthusiastic about if they want to learn more?
I guess that the Warwick has a staff. The department has a staff website. So if you I don't know the exact kind of www address to it, but in my let's say Verticom's personal page within the department, and I on Twitter, though not very active, but I guess that it's also a way to kind of see what the retweets and random tweets that I do, be able to see what interests me, if you want.
Okay, so what does the future of economics look like, according to you?
That is a very difficult question nowadays. It's always a difficult one, but I think it's a very difficult one now.
Why?
Because I think we are I don't know if we're at like a massive turning point, but lots of things are happening that are, I don't know if the word is new, but that are different, and I think hopefully will help a lot of people put in perspective what matters, and I don't know, it's a very difficult question.
That's fine.
Yeah, no, it's just I want to be optimistic, and I think I think, without sounding repetitive, I think there's a lot of people, especially young people like you and everyone at Rethinking, that is rethinking or trying to get out of that box, right? That is mainstream economics, if you want. So I have hope, because I think that group of people is pretty big and it's everywhere. So I'm really hopeful in that sense. I do also think that, we're in for a bumpy ride, in terms of what's going to happen, and how we get out of this COVID situation that we're in. So I'm hopeful for because, there's a critical mass of people that questions and wants to know more and wants to go beyond the textbooks, if you want. But but in terms of kind of the everyday lives, I don't know what we're in for, and it doesn't seem like it's going to be easy. So I'm not that optimistic on that side, unfortunately.
So, final question, what is your advice for future economists?
I guess that it goes towards. I know sounds like a very circular interview in a way, because I feel like there's certain topics. I guess that that's what I care about, and those are my views. It's trying to be question and be critical, and don't take anything at face value. And I'm just not talking about numbers here. I'm talking about stuff that the textbooks say, and even the papers say, that you are quite interested. You're reading a paper that you think is really interesting. Still, read into it with a skeptical mindset. Question everything, as they say. I think that's the best advice.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining me today, Cecilia. This was a
Thank
wonderful
you.
conversation.
Yeah, it was great talking to you.
Have a great day.
You too.